Hello and welcome, I'm Gina Shakespeare. Today on Declassified, we take a deep dive into Chinese and Russian spy operations in Silicon Valley. Our senior investigative reporter, Joshua Philipp, had the pleasure of sitting down with former senior Navy intelligence officer John Jordan to discuss these spy networks, as well as Chinese and Russian programs for economic theft.
John, why don't you give us a bit about your background, and we can get into the main topics.
Well, I was privileged to serve in the Navy for quite some time, and I live in Sonoma County, California, and have a technology company, and serve on the board of overseers for the Hoover Institution at Stanford in Palo Alto. So this world is kind of rubbed up against mine now for years in several different ways. Interesting.
So a lot of us, at least I haven't heard of Ministry of State Security operating in Silicon Valley. I know that they do, say, United Front operations, where they have, say, front companies or student groups or, investors going in there and looking for technology to bring back to China. But Ministry of State Security, this is interesting. What do you know about this?
Well, you would never associate California with Russian and Chinese spying operations. But the fact is that Silicon Valley has been a den of espionage activity going back to the 1970s and 80s. And that was when the Bay Area, there was a big naval base at Alameda and a big army base at the Presidio. The Russians outside of Washington had always invested more resources of the first directorate of the KGB into Northern California than any other part of the United States. Then we move into China's emergence as a world power and in the post-Cold War era, and China's rapid economic expansion. And unlike the Russians, whose interests were at the time were solely military and political, but primarily military in the Bay Area, China has come to understand the power of the innovation of Silicon Valley and the technologies that come from there, and what a big piece of bootstrapping the Chinese economy into the 21st century. And the Chinese have adopted a broad range of strategies that are in many ways far more sophisticated than anything the Russians have done or are doing today.
Interesting. So what would you say the key difference is between the nature of the Russian intelligence operations and the Chinese intelligence operations?
Well, as we were discussing off camera, as you pointed out, Josh, that the Russian effort has always been very traditional spying. It's it's girl traps. They call them honey traps in the trade. It's very top-down, directed, where they're looking for specific information or a specific technology, where their agents in place are given very specific taskings. Russian thinking on this is morphing now and becoming more and more following the Chinese model. But the Chinese model is far more comprehensive. Their efforts to penetrate American society in this respect and obtain technologies, there's numerous different ways in which they do it. Obviously, there's 300,000 Chinese students in the United States, and pretty much all of them are taking a hard science, a STEM, science, technology, engineering, or math. They're not majoring in social justice outrage or whatever's the rage in American campuses today. Moreover, there's investors that come into China, into Silicon Valley, to hire talent, to get people who want to go work in China, innovators to go work in China. They also want to buy companies in Silicon Valley. You also have the Chinese Students and Scholars Associations, which are run through Chinese embassies and consulates throughout the United States that kind of keep tabs on Chinese students, encourage them to, keep tabs on them, encourage them, whether it's dealing with the Falun Gong or Tibetan issues, but they make their presence known in their lives too. And that's another big piece of growing these technologies. The Chinese want to buy it and then they want to bring it back and grow it, where the Russians kind of historically have always wanted to kind of just take a bite here and a bite there.
Interesting. And this is an interesting topic because I would say one of the reasons why a lot of people can't understand Chinese spy operations is because a lot of the spies are not official spies, right? So you mentioned the Chinese Student and Scholar Associations. This is, of course, operated through the consulates, financed a lot of times through the consulates, but they're oftentimes unassuming Chinese students who are trying to advance their careers, who are being told, this is where your country wants you to go into here, we'll get you a job, go into here, it'll benefit your family. But it's done with the intention of either having them learn certain things which they can bring back to China, or intentionally placing them into key positions in government or business where they can, serve their country, either by staying in place or returning to China. And it's the same thing with a lot of the economic theft. A lot of the people stealing it, from what I understand, are not necessarily the main spies. They're people being handled by the spies. And oftentimes they'll only have to steal one or two things, which means it's hard to prosecute them. Is this what you're seeing as well?
It is. Successful spy rings are run when a handler is able to operate multiple agents in place. And that's certainly the Chinese. That's certainly the Chinese model. It's safety in numbers. One of the other differences between the Chinese efforts and the Russian efforts is that China has the industrial and technological wherewithal inside China to make use of a lot of these technologies and integrate it into factories and construction processes and things of that nature, where the Russians really don't. Russia really is about the economy is smaller than that of Texas, where China is truly an economic power and able to digest a lot of these technologies successfully.
This is interesting. I think there are two angles on this we could go into. One is that we have given China our factories. We've given them the manufacturing know-how, right? In terms of the areas of industrial warfare, where you're providing, say, channels to establish production know-how, you're making people who are capable of producing. You need to develop the supply chains, you need to develop the systems to develop the systems that manufacture, management structures for those systems. It's not easy to just go off and build these out of nothing. We've given them that. And the other interesting part is the nature of how information is stolen and transferred. I know that China has what they call technology transfer centers, where after it's stolen from the United States, it goes through, say, university-affiliated organizations which specialize in reverse engineering technology. And you mentioned as well the differences between the Russian and Chinese, say, methods of stealing technology. There's an interesting history on that. And I can tell you briefly what I understand, and I'm interested in hearing your thoughts also. The Russians, at least during the Cold War, they were trying to reverse engineer from the top. You look at, say, a fifth generation technology, you just try to build it, even though you're at, say, first or second. The Chinese, they came in and they realized they were just coming out of, somewhat of a feudal society, that they were nowhere near the level of that technology. So instead of trying to develop it from the top, what they did is they went and saw what are the public domain systems we can learn to build. So they would learn generation 1 first, then generation 2, then generation 3, say using open source information. For generation 4, maybe they have to send students to study abroad or send people to go work as interns at companies to learn how to do it. Once they mastered generation 4, the jump from generation 4 to 5 was much simpler because the person with the background and foundational understandings could look at that new device and say, oh, they changed this and this. And what would you say this is an accurate assessment, and what's your thoughts on this?
Well, absolutely. This is, again, Russia, you can say it's coming out of a feudal society. You can argue that it still is one in many respects. But China's successes in terms of integrating and making itself part of Silicon Valley and facilitating these technology transfers has been very successful. And that doesn't mean that that the Chinese economy in many ways has fully taken advantage of this. They've been successful in obtaining this, but China still has some very real challenges in terms of taking some of these technologies and making them effective weapons. I mean, if we're going to use we're going to discuss in the military sense. They haven't really. They still have some. The PLA still has some very big challenges in that respect, largely because it's still a conscript military. But they have been successful, and it's something for us to watch, to be cautious about as Americans. In 1996, the Economic Industrial Espionage Act was passed, and no one was ever convicted of it until around 2004. And this is a law that, for the first time, criminalizes not just the sale of national security secrets by government insiders, but the theft and resale of technologies on the private sector is now criminalized. And there's been a few high-profile prosecutions in California in district court there, but it's still got a long ways to go. Law enforcement still has a lot of catching up to do.
Interesting. Yeah, a couple areas we could go into here. I'm interested in the conscript military first. Maybe we could talk about that. You mentioned that that's one of the reasons why the Chinese military isn't as effective as maybe we think it is. Could you explain
The
this?
Chinese military isn't as effective as it's largely perceived to be in the West, and for the same reasons largely that the Russian military had their challenges in the Cold War. Specifically, when you have somebody in an army for 2 years, they can't really learn to operate all of the technologies and learn to work as a team and get that type of practical experience before they're out. Inside the U.S. military, you're in, even as an enlisted person, the average is 4 to 7 years. And many people are in there for make entire careers out of it. In American society, being in the military is seen as an honorable profession, is desirable. It's hard to get into a service academy or get a commission in the military. It's in China, the military is where you kind of go because it's a place where you can get fed and you can be kept warm. And it doesn't place the emphasis on the training at the lower levels, the junior officer and the enlisted levels that we certainly do. Warfare has changed since our last encounter with the Chinese military in Korea in the early 50s, when men with rifles, Stalin said, quantity has a quality all of its own. That is no longer true on the modern battlefield, where the emphasis is on technology and integrating that technology into a warfighting system. A gadget doesn't become a weapon until it's able to be used effectively under stress by people that maybe aren't an engineer or a scientist.
Yeah, very interesting. Very interesting. And it's interesting, too, because I know in the U.S. there's been arguments for and against the whole volunteer system we have. It's interesting to understand the other side of that the conscript system also has its flaws. Maybe it's not worth training people as hard if they're going to be out in 2 years and just regard it as...
You can't train, you cannot create an effective warfighter in 2 years in most military specialties.
Interesting. Now, if we could switch back again to the Ministry of State Security, could you explain to our viewers, I guess, what your views are on the nature of its operations, and how does the Ministry of State Security in its operations differ from, say, Chinese student and scholar associations or other groups from the Chinese Communist Party we know are active in Silicon Valley?
Well, I'm not sure where the Ministry of State Security begins, and a lot of these other, I'm not sure where that line is. As an American, I tend to suspect that the Ministry of State Security, at a minimum, has a say in all of these operations. So I don't think anybody's really sure where their purview begins and ends. But I think it's safe to assume, and it'd be dangerous to assume otherwise, that they're not involved as much as they can be. And certainly internal Chinese politics inside the Politburo in Beijing, everybody seems to want a bigger share of the pie. And so I have a hard time seeing the Ministry of State Security not being ambitious in terms of having as large a role as possible.
Great. If I could give some of my analysis on this too. It's interesting. From what I've been told, so Ministry of State Security is government side. If we talk about a lot of the cyber attacks and cyber theft, a lot of that's done through the military side. They've switched it up a bit, but generally it's understood as General Staff Department, 3rd Department does the signals intelligence operations. Unit 61398 of that, which is about 1 out of 22 operational bureaus, does the cyber attacks. They're the ones hacking our networks and stealing our stuff. Now, right next to the Third Department, you have the 3rd Department, you have the 2nd Department, and they specialize in human intelligence operations. They're the ones actually infiltrating businesses, infiltrating government, and they work hand in hand with the hackers. So let's say you're a spy inside of a big company and you want to steal something one day. They'll have you steal that thing, and then they'll launch a cyber attack against that same network. And so when they go and do forensics, they'll say, oh, it was stolen through a cyber attack. Or if it even goes as far as the courts, they can say, you're accusing me of this, but there was a cyber attack. This is obviously just racism, or whatever. You're discriminating against me. And they know how to work our system like that. But on that note, too, the government spies and the military spies of the Chinese system, they do not get along with each other, from what I've been told. In fact, they'll even sabotage each other and fight each other, from what I've been told. Yeah.
Well, the human intelligence side, obviously, China is an advantage in that there is a large Chinese population in the Bay Area. The Chinese language is nearly impossible for Anglophones to learn. There is a real shortage of Chinese speakers, let alone ones that have completed the vetting process, let's just say, inside our intelligence and counterintelligence organizations. So that in conjunction with what you're saying, the muddying the waters, prosecutions become very difficult, as does rolling up a spy line.
Yeah, and it's important to clarify too. A lot of people, one of the biggest blockades in terms of prosecuting Chinese spies is the race card, because China very heavily focuses on race in its spy recruitment. That's just how it is. And so when you go after Chinese spy cases, a lot of times it looks like discrimination. I know the FBI was running into a lot of problems on this. There were some reports back in like 2007 on this. But there are two different branches that work on this. There's the United Front Department and there's the Overseas Chinese Affairs Office. United Front, say, expands the lines, expands the systems of control into Chinese neighborhoods, and they'll go through fraternal organizations, tongs, things that kind of work as the backbone of Chinese communities, gain control of them, and then gain influence through these systems. Overseas Chinese Affairs Office then manages these systems as if they were Chinese provinces. And Overseas Chinese Affairs Office also regards second and third generation Chinese as Chinese citizens. Which is, it's interesting, the whole racial issue.
Sure.
And the other part you mentioned is the how should I say, the issue of population. And this is something that is often missed when we try to interpret the Russian threat. Now, during the Cold War, the Russians had, they were trying to push the communist revolution, right? They were able to do this largely because they had, college professors, politicians, movie stars, all kinds of stuff, promoting as well the Russian interest. A lot of the communist parties of that era were subservient to the Soviet Union. They followed the Soviet Union, which is one of the reasons why it was so controversial being a card-carrying communist at the time, was because if you did so, you were loyal to the Communist Party of Russia. And so when Russia lost that, they lost most of their grassroots footwork, systems they could use to influence and direct. The Chinese Communist Party still maintains that to a massive extent. And I believe this is one of the most overlooked elements of, say, not only, say, spying, but also unconventional warfare. What are your thoughts about this?
Well, obviously the racial dimension is enormous. I mean, it's very difficult to tell if somebody's a Russian or not. I mean, and you have a lot of Americans of Russian ancestry in this country. With regard to there's a saying in the spy world that agents or traitors, spies, are recruited. The rule is mice: money, ideology, conscience, or ego. And oftentimes, with regard to China, there's to some degree a loyalty to the country of their parentage, and it's difficult to vet through that. And there's as we talked about, a significant Chinese population in San Francisco. As you touched on, there's also a political dimension to this too. That various organs of the Communist Party, the Chinese government, wish to have influence or have understanding of the American political system and how political policy is made. We had a lady by the name of Rosa Pack who died in San Francisco some years ago. It was always alleged that she was one of the big kingmakers in San Francisco politics for a long time.
This was unknown on the surface that she was helping get politicians elected.
Oh, she was one of the queen bees of California, of San Francisco politics, and it was always alleged but never proven that she was an operative of an agency of the Chinese government. It was never proven. So there's a political dimension to this too. It's gaining political intelligence, understanding how American policy is made, to try to read the tea leaves in that, so to speak, so that the Chinese government can counter it effectively. Also to understand, perhaps to gain influence over American policymakers. And I think if the allegations against Ms. Pack were in fact valid, I think that may have been one of her taskings.
You mentioned the motivations for engaging in espionage, mice being the U.S. views on this system. The Chinese system is different. They identify flaws in a person's moral character that they can exploit. and that is greed, power, lust, and fame. And so academics, if they believe they want, I mean, generally speaking, they'll profile you piece by piece. They'll go on your link. It's easy. You go on LinkedIn, you look at a company you want to infiltrate. You type it in LinkedIn. You map the entire company. You find the people in key positions, very likely IT guys, and then senior executives. You go on their social media pages and you find what they're interested in. Before you know it, you have an entire profile of an individual that can be used for these kinds of operations within like 10 minutes. Map the whole company, find the key people, and then map their interests, 10, 15 minutes. So an academic, you can say, well, they probably want people to look at their work. They want recognition for their work. That's fame. So they can invite them to China, give them the red carpet treatment, say, have Chinese students ask intelligent questions and then say, oh, why does America not trust us? And you start planting these ideas into their minds that make them question the narrative that they've been told, right? A lot of this stuff is grown slowly, and there's an ideological dimension which is often overlooked, I think, on the U.S. side. And there's also, of course, lust. If you're a politician and they want to get you, they'll invite you to China. Maybe they'll offer you, a side business, some investment business or something like that. That's one thing. But another thing is maybe they'll get you drunk and then you'll wake up in a bed with a young girl and they'll have cameras all around and you're blackmailed for the rest of your life. This is what Chinese espionage looks like. I know the Russians do honey traps as well, as you mentioned earlier. I'm curious, what are your thoughts on in terms of, well, I guess what are your thoughts on this first in terms of the differences in spying between the U.S. side and Chinese side, in terms of how we evaluate it? I know their systems are a lot different than how we operate.
China has an advantage over us, a structural advantage. It's one you touched on briefly, is that America is an open society, and America is the PC politically correct culture is placing American security at risk. We're an open society. We're a multiracial society. It is difficult offensively for American intelligence services we have to do it differently. We just aren't as able to insert ourselves into foreign companies, foreign agencies of foreign governments as easily because there are laws that constrain the behavior of American intelligence agencies as well as law enforcement. And everybody knows what these laws are. You don't have to watch Law and Order 5 times to figure this out, right? Moreover, when we are overseas, we have to penetrate an order with one of their people, and it's more difficult for us to check and vet and make sure that person isn't a dangle or isn't a double agent or isn't somebody that is a walk-in who's being planted to specifically give us disinformation, because we don't have millions and millions we're not a racially distinct country with a large overseas population. Yeah.
And that's an interesting part too, is if we want to send people to China, they look like Americans.
And they know they're Americans, and they're watched.
Yeah. And they keep their own people under watch pretty close, so they know who belongs and who doesn't, so to speak.
Yeah. I mean, you can have Chinese Americans who speak English without an accent, absolutely perfect. I don't think that's even possible for us to fit in. Not only that, just physically to fit in. I mean, but the idea of a Chinese person speaking perfect English at a football game, you can't tell who's good and who's bad, who's an American patriot and who might be an operative for the MSS. And that's a huge structural advantage. And then you toss in American political correctness and our own legal system, and there's our disadvantage.
And this is interesting. I've been told this by some Chinese expats as well, that the Chinese Communist Party is taking advantage of the open system of the United States. It's easy to subvert an open society. And one important factor in this is a lot of people may not realize is one of the key Chinese military doctrines is the 3 warfares doctrine. The 3 warfares are legal warfare, media warfare, and psychological warfare. Now, psychological warfare is it isn't to alter the information. It is to alter how you interpret information. It's the war for narratives. It's the war for your worldview, right? Media warfare is controlling systems of exposure to information, or controlling what is said and what is not said. Legal warfare is manipulating local, international legal systems to, say, stall issues in legal cycles to avoid open warfare. We saw this used extremely well. I mean, giving them some credit, I guess. The Chinese Communist Party used this very well in the South China Sea, where what could have been a military conflict was solved through narrative, through attacking our perception of legal rights, through keeping the issue in the court system rather than on the battlefield, right? They used three warfare's doctrine to a T in South China Sea. And this is the other thing too, is when we're an open society, it's easy to manipulate people's psychology to accomplish different goals. The United States doesn't really engage in narrative warfare, I guess you could call it. We don't really try to push the American story so much. Actually, I'd say that a lot of our politicians are arguably more anti-America story than pro-America story. You know, our own politicians do the work that these people would want to be doing. Yeah.
Well, that as an open society, one of the natures of a democracy, and this isn't just solely true of the United States, but of Western Europe, and those of generally democratically elected leadership, is that we tend not to have a propaganda arm. We tend not to have a Ministry of Information, where closed societies do, because closed societies have to control the narrative. They have to control information. Because closed societies, if you really believe that history is on the side of freedom and democracy, and I tend to believe it is, you don't need those tools. I mean, closed communist societies have failed time and time again. So I think that's more, in the long run, that's more a measure of a weakness of a society than its strength.
I agree with you. I would say one of the biggest problems I've seen, though, is when it comes to China trying to subvert, waging ideological warfare, psychological warfare, media warfare, you know, however you want to categorize it, right? They have topics you cannot talk about if you want to stay in China. And so when it comes to media, we have journalists who they will not talk about sensitive topics, right? They won't touch on a lot of these sensitive topics, and they also have to play up the Chinese narrative. We have this be balanced absolutely, even if what you're being told from the Chinese side is a lie, right? And same thing with the academic community. A lot of, if you go to China and you start talking about human rights, democracy in Hong Kong, persecution of Falun Gong, as we mentioned before, persecution of Tibetans, they're going to blacklist you. And suddenly, you know, whatever you studied your whole life is suddenly useless, unless you want to go back to the United States and write books about, you know, being kicked out of China or something.
If there's one unreported story, and this is something we were talking about earlier, is that China is not, Americans tend to see it as monolithic. They don't see a lot of the complexities and demographic challenges and economic, frankly, backwardness of huge parts of China, and that China isn't necessarily as stable a society as is perceived in the West. And China has some real challenges. I mean, does anybody really believe their economic growth numbers? I mean, the Soviet Gosplan, which is their Ministry of Economic Planning, lied to the Politburo all the time. I find it hard to believe that in China the same thing isn't happening. What with zombie factories, even their military controls its own industrial empire, enormous waste of resources and enormous inefficiencies in China as well.
Yeah, there's some interesting stories about that. We had a story one time where China wanted to, basically when China realizes that it needs to build foundational technologies, computer chips, you know, internet infrastructure, satellites, GPS, you know, these kinds of things. When they were trying to build the chips, they invested in a whole bunch of projects and people to work on it. One of the chip makers who they approved, it turned out later what they had done was they bought Intel chips and they scraped off the Intel logo and then brought the Intel chip to present and saw, look what we did. Then they took the money they got to finance their research and invested it in real estate.
Some countries go to jail for that. That's a form of fraud.
Yeah.
But China is a complex. It's got enormous strengths and certain advantages in its competition with the United States. But it's got its internal structural weaknesses as well. I mean, their military is all conscript. They have a hard time doing simple things in their military that we take for granted in ours. I mean, what with their problems with their aircraft carrier and so forth. But it's a lot of the foundational technology is not there. Free market economics hasn't fully taken root in China yet, and so they're not able to fully take full advantage of some of the technologies they do have because of the heavy-handed nature of the state in managing their economy.
Right, and this is a problem I've been told before too, is that when you see the pictures of China, you're seeing the pictures of China that they want you to see. The media that they bring to China are all in the nicest parts. They're not showing you the other parts. It's a communist system. The people with money are Communist Party members, right?
It's like Animal Farm. Some from George Orwell. Some animals are more equal than others.
Yeah, and of course China's trying to build a middle class right now, but it's not going so well from what I've been told and what I've seen. We talked a little bit about military capability, and I think this is an interesting topic because the Chinese military is hard to crack. A lot of what they show on the surface is not as functional as they might lead us to believe. They're showcasing their 5th generation fighter jet that has, 4 and 4.5 generation parts that could not be used, from what I understand, in a 5th generation fighter jet, where it was built off of modeled essentially off a 4.5 generation Soviet jet. That was never implemented.
It was never placed into serial production.
Yeah,
right?
And we see this through a lot of their technologies. And I think at least a few years ago, I don't know if it's still the case, but even the communication systems, the ability to have an integrated military doesn't work. The ability to have large transit systems where you could quickly move parts of your military from one place to another is extremely inefficient. Maybe that'll change a little bit with the new Silk Road program. A lot of the economic stuff they're building is dual use, of course.
I don't think a lot of the command and control challenges that the Chinese military faces in terms of taking a device and making it a weapon and turning people into warfighters happens until they professionalize their military. I mean, there's a quantum leap qualitatively between those militaries that are largely volunteer and those that are conscript. And I don't think that until you invest in the human capital side of this to make it all work, all the technology in the world, it just becomes a collection of gizmos.
Great. So we could talk about this from 3 angles. So there's the normal military, which is what most of the world is looking at. I think internally it acts as a propaganda mechanism. It helps incite this, pride of my country feeling for the Chinese. And they have it keeps the real hardliners at bay. Keeps them satisfied. And for the West, for the average population, and honestly a lot of the media too, it keeps them thinking China's rising, saying China's rising and these things. Maybe for the military guys, they know it's a bunch of nonsense, but they're looking at other systems as well. The 2 I would like to talk about are the unrestricted warfare doctrine, which 3 warfare doctrine is part of, and the other being the Assassin's Mace program. Now, I know that book by Michael Pillsbury, The 100-Year Marathon, talks about 3 warfare's doctrine as being the one system that when it was applied during a red team, blue team operation, they do military simulations. When he applied that, it was the one time the United States lost a military simulation. And the Assassin's Mace program, it's basically different types of unconventional weapons, surprise attack, and different strategies meant to allow a technologically inferior country to defeat a technologically superior country. And so what it does is it attacks the foundations of capabilities. Satellites, if you destroy our satellites, suddenly our missile guidance systems no longer work. Our troops can no longer communicate. Our ability to target, our ability to operate is gone. ships need to go back to compasses and these kinds of things, which I know they're training for training for how to operate in denied environments. I know they're doing this. The other thing they would do is say, instead of destroying an aircraft carrier, you just destroy the runway. That was one thing. Instead of destroying jets, you destroy, let's say, the command control tower. These kinds of things. And then you launch, it would look, the form it would take would be a surprise attack. All this would happen at once. They would launch surprise attacks at, say, key military bases, maybe cargo ships carrying nuclear weapons, that kind of thing. But now, realistically, what are your thoughts on this?
Realistically, yeah. We need to break this down in terms of China's real military capabilities and security threats from the Chinese point of view of what they're actually likely to do. I'm dubious of these types of studies, and kind of when you look at it from the Chinese point of view, here's kind of why. The People's Liberation Army, the conscript army we've talked about, part of the reason it's there is because that's a way of keeping a large percentage of the population in control. That's the insurance policy. That's the life insurance policy for the Communist Party of China.
And it's important to mention, too, the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, is not to protect the Constitution like in America. It's not to protect the country. It's to protect the Chinese Communist Party.
And for that you need lots of men with rifles, and that's kind of the reason for being for the People's Liberation Army. Now, stepping back and taking your construct and looking at for likely conflict with China, and what is that going to look like? Military confrontation with China, if there is one, is going to be what's called an air-sea battle. It isn't going to be hundreds of thousands of troops. It's not going to be the Korean War, Part 2. It's going to be in the South China Sea, or perhaps involving the Spratly Islands, or perhaps in and around the Malacca Strait, which is one of the busiest shipping channels in the world. China also doesn't have the ability to project military power beyond any further than the South China Sea. Now, sure, they sail ships into the Persian Gulf every now and then, and they've sailed some ships in the Atlantic, but that's different from being able to project power there. In terms of launching a surprise detonation of a nuclear weapon, which is traditionally something that's going back to the 60s that we looked at with the Russians, called the fractional orbital bombardment system. And that is setting off a fairly large nuclear weapon, generally in the megaton range, in the atmosphere. The idea is that the EMP, the electromagnetic pulse, is damaging to all electronics of all kinds, including potentially satellites. Satellites are a little harder to whack, to neutralize than people think. And it isn't generally, space is an awful big place. And you look at these orbits of some of these satellites, hundreds and hundreds of miles in space. You need an EMP attack is going to be devastating to consumer electronics, and it's going to kill your TV and your refrigerator. But a lot of military hardware is now hardened against that. And so I think that was going to be more viable militarily in the early chip, transistor, and the chips of 40, 50 years ago, and the technology we use then. A lot of it's hardened now. Satellites are different. You need a dedicated anti-satellite program. The Russians tested something last week that looks like a fairly modern, we can't tell because we don't have the full telemetry we understand how successful that test was, but it looks like they're trying to at least put somebody either test or make us think that they're successfully testing a viable system. So really taking out those command communication nodes is a far tougher nut to crack.
Interesting. Yeah, I know they've worked on anti-satellite weapons like missiles and such, but we're trying to get around it with like microsatellites, these things. It's an interesting picture. Now, when it comes to what I would argue is the actual main force of the Chinese military, this is when we get into unrestricted warfare. And unrestricted warfare is broken into three parts. So, of course, one of the buzzwords now is hybrid warfare, asymmetrical warfare. Hybrid warfare is just a fancy way of saying using unconventional methods in conjunction with each other. You use a media operation in conjunction with a military operation. So the media operation can make arguments for what you're doing to try to prevent intervention from another country, for example.
Well, it goes back to what Sun Tzu said, that wars are moral contests and they're won in the temples before they're ever fought.
Yeah.
And so that's to undermine your adversary's willingness to escalate a conflict. The idea is that context was enable China to initiate some sort of local military action and then contain it. Because an all-out war doesn't do China. China would ultimately be the loser in an all-out war. I mean, but the idea is that they could intervene militarily, say the Spratlys, that's a favorite, right? And then contain the damage and then win the narrative, and that undermines, then does the American public really get behind, Japanese and the Japanese and the Filipinos with regard to the Spratlys? I don't know, and I think that's what you're talking about. That's what they're being very smart about.
Yeah, so unrestricted warfare is broken into 3 tiers. There's non-military, trans-military, and military. The non-military tactics could be business warfare, which is attacking, say, the interests of individual businesses, economic warfare to attack the industries that affect the GDP of a nation, psychological warfare to alter how people interpret information, so on. I won't go into all of them, there are tons of them. Trans-military would be like cyber attacks, things like that, so on and so on. And of course, military would be what we consider conventional military. When we talk about, say, force projection, China getting out of, say, their own little region. They're trying to build the whole string of pearls. They built the Djibouti, base in Djibouti, yes, of course, which, funny enough, they denied they were doing until it was already built. They're trying to do that at every trade choke point. A key point to remember is if you go back to the ages of, say, golden age of pirates and the rise of international trade, right? The control of trade choke points is one of the major points in all this.
I'm really glad you brought up the string of pearls and the artificial bases. Militarily, they're not as potent as the American public thinks. They cannot operate large numbers of aircraft out of them. To make a modern fighter or fighter bomber a weapon, it requires 20 to 30 people. You need the maintenance, you need the fuel depot, you need the munition storage, you need to be able to have the parts. They can't operate them, large numbers of fighters, with an operational tempo that is anything really more than local patrolling. But more to the point, and this goes back to what we were talking about command and control, they don't have their own radar environment there. And an American carrier battle group, by contrast, has its own airborne radars in the form of the E-2 Hawkeyes, where our fighters are told where to go because we have an electronic map of the battlefield. China is really stuck with, in the South China Sea, is stuck with their ground-based radars, which are very vulnerable, very easy to deal with. I think that those bases are kind of a political show of force to kind of establish a territory that now they can say there's a territorial claim, there's an island. I think those are more political construction projects than providing China with a viable military option.
I agree with you. This is great analysis, actually. And the other thing, too, is actually they're trying to build their own GPS system. You need this for ship navigation. You need this for any viable military operation. China is building its own GPS system, but it's limited to the China region. A little bit beyond it, but generally that region. And it's true, too, that in my analysis, any real future warfare conflict is going to be heavy around electronic warfare.
Yeah, in air sea, because it's going to be, China's economic interests, China's military interests are its economic interests. And furthermore, and so any conflict is going to involve the control of shipping, or perhaps for an adversary of China, the denial to China of a lot of those shipping lanes. So it's going to be ships, airplanes, and microchips.
Interesting. And so this is, of course, analyzing it from the military side. The other side is the economic and ideological side. Now, if we go back to, say, Vietnam, the Vietnamese would say that they lost the war of bullets, but they won the war of words. And by winning the war of words, they won the conflict. The Chinese, of course, they're looking at similar ways of warfare. Warfare for them is not limited to kinetic warfare, like conventional warfare. When it comes to the ideological realm, and when it comes to the economic realm, it's interesting. I think they're still technically losing on both fronts because of the human rights abuses and the ongoing perception of, I'd say, poverty in China and other issues in China that they've created for themselves even, and the other side is the business element. China's numbers are not what they say they are. Anyone who actually analyzes their GDP numbers can tell you that the rate of growth is stabilized based off what the CCP said they wanted it to be. And if you look at actual operations of companies, they keep their lights on, they're not producing anything. There's a big show going on, this big, what do you call it, Potemkin Village
Potemkin villages
situation going on when it comes to China. The question is will the perception of these things allow them to succeed in that? Or can that perception be broken? What is your analysis on this?
Well, there's no other than Epoch News. There's nobody else in the American media really telling this story about Chinese weakness. Americans have a fixation. See, Americans are intimidated to a degree by China. And I think China has got American policymakers and the American public buffaloed in a lot of ways here. Not the least of which is, with regard to Chinese economic growth. Nobody sees some of the societal problems in China. It's interesting you talk about, you describe from almost sounding like a Chinese policymaker, is that conflict is a spectrum. And kinetic armed conflict is just but one slice on it. In the American analysis, it's binary. It's either you're friend or foe, you're at war or you're at peace. And the Chinese model is it's a spectral one, and kinetic warfare is just one piece of it. It's almost a von Clausewitzian, war is politics, it's continuation by another means. And so I think that's something that Americans don't really get, is that China already sees itself, Chinese leadership already sees itself in a massive contest with the United States.
Yeah, well, there are two parts on this. One is the views of traditional Chinese military tactics and thinking around military conflict, and two is how the Chinese Communist Party itself has warped those systems or taken what they wanted from it and abandoned other parts of it. And of course the influence of Soviet strategies as well, which also played a role, especially when it comes to subversion operations. Now people often talk about Sun Tzu. Sun Tzu is not the only source of Chinese military doctrine. There's tons of classics, 7 defined classics and many others. You have, of course, Sun Tzu, you have Tai Kung, 6 Secret Teachings of Tai Kung, Master of Demon Valley, all kinds of military doctrines and teachings. And all of them teach ways of fighting wars without fighting openly. Now, I had trouble interpreting this at first when I was looking into, trying to understand the nature of how Chinese military doctrine differs from Western military doctrine, and also how traditional Chinese military tactics differ from modern CCP, Chinese Communist Party military tactics. And what I realized is that what I've been told, at least, is that in traditional Chinese society, it was a Buddhist, Taoist society. Killing was something you wanted to avoid. And so they looked at ways to fight wars to as much of a degree as possible without engaging in open warfare. Of course, the Three Kingdoms era was the most violent one. When people talk about violence in Chinese history, they point to that era, but that was a very, very small portion of Chinese history. When you look at the actual way it was fought, if you had to engage in full open warfare, you had already lost wars at multiple different stages. You first try to there's the diplomatic, there's the friend stage where you're engaging in trade, where you're engaging in normal relations. There's a warfare doctrine for that. There's your diplomacy stage where you might have minor disagreements. There's your negotiating phase where you want something from someone. Now there are extents of this. There's extents where you want something and you have to take it through military action. There's extents where you're defending an interest to the point where you have to take it eventually. This proceeds to, say, sub-warfare, say mid-range warfare, where you're engaging in, say, minor conflicts, or your population has hatred for another province or something. That's another form of warfare. Then there's the try to decapitate the leadership warfare. You try to subvert them. There are tactics of getting, there was cases in ancient Chinese history of leaders using beautiful women to go in and just make a leader non-effective because he falls so deeply in love with her that he ignores his other obligations. Full open warfare is the last resort, and it's the one that if they have to go to, it means they've already lost every other stage of warfare they attempted. And it's true, the American system, we don't think of it like that. We just look at war and peace. That's it. At the same time, though, China is more fragile than they want the world to know. Their weakness is ideology, because ideology is propping up the perceptions of all the other systems that are not nearly as effective as they want the world to believe they are. Would you say this is accurate, or what's your analysis?
Well, without a doubt, and we've seen those nations which have pursued, which have become defined by an ideology, namely statism, whether it's in the name of National Socialism in Germany, Soviet communism, Cuban communism. These societies in the long run have never been hugely successful. And I think it's because they misunderstand the nature of human nature, specifically a person's desire for freedom, to achieve to enjoy the fruits of their labor, to grow as an individual. Those systems which have denied that have enjoyed some success. I mean, it's certainly been bloody in the 20th century alone, but have never fully reached their economic potential, nor have they been particularly stable.
That's true. And you mentioned the nature of freedom, which is what we have in the United States, at least for now. For now. Hopefully we can keep it. But that is the element that totalitarian societies are trying to attack. That is the target of disinformation. That is the main target of, in my analysis, of Russian disinformation operations, and especially of Chinese disinformation operations. They want to make it look like free societies are not capable of being stable. And so they will find every incident that will damage the perception that people, if given freedoms and if given certain rights, can themselves make proper choices without having a totalitarian leadership micromanaging their lives.
Well, there's a reason for this. There's a reason why these totalitarian societies have attacked this part of our society. And that is the very existence of a free and prosperous society. Just the existence of it in a world where information flows freely. There is nothing more dangerous for despots and tyrants than just the existence of a free and open society, because invariably their own people will draw comparisons, usually almost always unfavorable, between their own non-free society and what it's like to live in a free society. And oftentimes the tyrants have come to a bad end when their own people can make those comparisons. Great.
Good point. A good point to end on. Is there anything else you'd like to say, or any points you feel we missed you'd like to touch on?
I don't think we've missed a thing, and I hope that you'll have me back.
Great. Appreciate it. Thank you very much.